Philip Hammond, thanks very much for joining us. As a former Chancellor, you'll know more than most the complexities of funding social care. Do you think a national insurance rise is either desirable or workable as a solution?
No, I don't. And you're right. This has been a long running problem. To be frank with you, I was looking at this challenge when I was an opposition health spokesman nearly 20 years ago, and we haven't managed to solve it yet. This is an incredibly complex problem. But the issue is an increase in national insurance contributions is asking young working people, some of whom will never inherit a property, to subsidise older people who've accumulated wealth during their lifetime and have a property. And on any basis, that has got to be wrong.
And what do you think would be the best solution, having looked at it, as you say, over many years?
Well, I came to the conclusion some years ago that the only fair and workable answer is an insurance based scheme, and if necessary, that needs to be government backed. So people who have assets, who have wealth accumulated in the form of a house, if they want to protect themselves against care costs in old age, should be able to take out insurance, paying a premium which could be deferred until after their death and come out of the estate, so that families that wanted to protect the assets that have been built up were able to do so by paying a fixed and known amount of insurance premium. But it's wrong to ask poorer taxpayers to subsidise richer, older asset owners.
And we're told that one of the reasons the government have shied away from that solution about an insurance-based system is that they're just terrified of the political ramifications. That there could be just the smear could run quite quickly that actually they're in favour of privatising the NHS itself. How do you think they should sort of combat that?
Well, that's an absolutely nonsense argument. This is not about um, the funding of NHS provision. It's not even about how you pay for publicly funded long-term care, which the state already pays for people who do not have assets. The question that's being asked here is how do we deal with people who have assets, who own wealth, who need that wealth in their old age in order to support themselves? And in my view, a proper conservative approach is that you save during your lifetime in order to be self-sufficient in old age. And that's a sentiment that we should encourage. And insurance is a very sensible way of pooling the risk. Some people will need extensive care in old age, others will not. And none of us knows until we get there which category we will be in. So, an insurance based scheme backed by the government, which allowed somebody at, let's say, age 65 to make a decision whether they wanted to pay a one off premium and buy an insurance policy, that premium payable on their death, so coming out of the estate. So, for a fixed premium, that person would then know that their care costs were covered for their lifetime, or you could choose to take a chance and leave your assets at risk and avoid paying the premium. That seems to me the only fair way to go forward with people who have assets collectively cross-insuring each other, if you like, but people who don't have assets should not be asked to pay more tax to subsidise people who do.
No, you'll famously, of course, know more than most about what it's like to propose a national insurance rise. You tried it on the self-employed in 2017. There was a backlash at the time. Do you think the backlash this time will make that look like child's play if the Chancellor goes ahead with a national insurance rise?
By the way, I still think it was the right thing to do, increasing national insurance on the self-employed to closer to the level paid by the employed, because the benefits enjoyed by the self-employed from the state are now broadly similar to those enjoyed by the employed. But that's a debate for another day. Yes, I do. I think that if the government were to go ahead with the proposed increase in national insurance contributions, breaking a manifesto commitment in order to in order to underwrite the care costs of older people with homes, I think that would provoke a very significant backlash. I think it would cause the government, the Conservative Party, significant damage. I also think it's the wrong thing to do. It's not just about party political advantage. Economically, politically, expanding the state further in order to protect private assets by asking poor people to subsidize rich people has got to be the wrong thing to do.
Now, it was suggested at the time of your own issue with NI that actually you privately felt that the manifesto pledge from 2015 was just too restrictive for any sensible treasury, not raising income tax, not raising VAT, not raising national insurance, just limits your room for manoeuvre as a chancellor. Do you
Yeah.
think there is some sympathy for perhaps dropping that as a manifesto pledge next time?
Yeah, I think there's a very good argument for not making those kind of pledges precisely because no chancellor, no party leader knows what the future is going to bring. When those pledges were made, no one could have envisaged the COVID epidemic, for example. No one could have envisaged the global financial crisis. But the lesson here is that chancellors should keep their powder dry. But too often, party leaders make commitments for them that then constrain them and mean that the economic management of the country, the fiscal management of the country, is constrained in a way that doesn't really make sense.
The other challenge facing Rishi Sunak this week is how to balance the books over the pandemic. Do you think he'd be wise to pause or amend the triple lock policy on pensions?
I think what the triple lock is a very expensive commitment, but it's a commitment the Conservative Party has made, and I think we should not move away from the principle of it. However, when a strange statistical quirk occurs that's going to produce an unfair result, you should address it. And the answer here is to smooth the application of the triple lock over 2 years so that the extraordinary fall in average wages and then the surge in average wages that followed after the lockdown shouldn't give rise to an unfair, unwarranted increase in pensions. We should just smooth it over 2 years as a one off extraordinary measure to deal with the consequences of COVID and then allow the triple lock to carry on because we've pledged to do so.
Now, the spending review is coming up later this year. Again, something that you've had to deal with in many years previously. Do you think there is now a case, as some Conservative MPs are suggesting, that actually spending cuts should be back in the mix? It shouldn't all be about tax rises.
Yes, it has to be a mix of constraint on spending and probably some increases in taxes as well. And I think we also have to face the fact that borrowing is going to be higher, probably for the foreseeable future, than we would have expected if we were looking at this question a couple of years ago. We can't deny the reality of what has happened through no fault of our own, through the coronavirus crisis. We've lost a great deal of output, and you can't magic that output back by waving a chancellor's wand. We have to somehow absorb the impact of that, and that's got to come through a combination of lower public spending in the future, somewhat higher taxes in the future, and probably a bit more borrowing as well. It's a very unpleasant, unpalatable message, but that is the truth.
Some Conservative MPs have suggested that this NI rise is basically a socialist move. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about where you felt the Tory party was politically and philosophically right now. I mean, you said after the whip was withdrawn in 2019 that the party was, there were people who wanted to turn it from a broad church into an extreme right wing faction, and it wasn't the party I joined anymore. You've now got the Tory whip back. You're a Tory peer in the Lords. What is your position now on where the party is?
Well, I think many of the entryists who clearly were trying to take control of the party, the avant-garde of the Vote Leave campaign, if you like, have been ousted from the positions of power and influence. There are still some of them left, but the attempt to take over the party has not succeeded. Mr. Cummings apparently is now turning his attention to the Republican Party in the US. But the Tory party needs to reassert its core values. And one of those core values is being fiscally responsible. That doesn't mean that we're constantly in an austerity period or constantly opposed to public spending, but it does mean that we have to recognize the realities of the world we're in, and we can't just pretend that things like the global financial crisis or the COVID pandemic haven't happened. They have happened. Everybody knows that they've had an impact on our economy and our public finances. And the Chancellor has to come forward with sensible, well thought through proposals for dealing over the medium term with the consequences of those impacts. And I'm sure that's what he will want to do, deal with this over the medium term. We can't sort of recover the cost of the COVID pandemic overnight. That would be an impossible hit to our economy and to our taxpayers. But over a sort of period of a decade, we've got to deal with the consequences of the COVID pandemic on our economy and our public finances.
Can I ask you briefly about Afghanistan now? Dominic Raab right about the bigger picture? The real problem he suggested was successive governments not having a coherent strategy on Afghanistan, let alone an exit strategy.
Well, I'm rather skeptical about an exit strategy. I think what happened in Afghanistan, when I was Defence Secretary, we begun the drawdown from our combat role, and we were very nervous about what would happen. But in fact, 6, 7 years later, we had a relatively stable situation in the country. There was an insurgency going on. The government didn't control all of the territory, but in the major cities and in significant strategic routes across the countryside, the Afghan government was still in some kind of control. Life went on, girls went to school, women were able to go to work. And the price of all this was a very small contingent of Western troops providing a backbone to the Afghan National Security Forces. And in my view, the sensible thing to do would have been to continue that presence indefinitely in Afghanistan, just as the US has had troops stationed in Japan since the Second World War, has had troops stationed in South Korea since the end of the Korean War. Sometimes you have to we've had troops stationed in Germany since the end of the Second World War too. Sometimes you have to make a long-term commitment to ensure the peace. And I think if we'd been prepared to continue that small-scale presence in Afghanistan, life would have been able to go on, and the future of Afghanistan would have been a lot more positive than it's looking now. And by the way, we would have continued to deny Afghanistan to our strategic challengers, Russia and China, who will now make hay in the space that the US has created.
Philip, good morning. It's Tom. Thanks for joining us. A couple of quick
Morning, Tom.
questions for me. Let me take you back to that national insurance contributions rise, which you've just expressed some extremely strong feelings about. We have little doubt it's probably still going to go ahead. You might get a vote on it. You're sitting in the House of Lords. It may well come in front of you in the finance bill or something else. Would you vote against it?
Well, famously, the House of Lords doesn't get to vote on the finance bill, but national insurance is not usually included in the finance bill. It'll be separate legislation. And yes, I would vote against that.
What about something to dilute the pain of it? For example, it's been suggested you could broaden national insurance to include rental income, dividend income, pensions income. That would also mean that pensioners, those receiving that social care, would be in part paying it. Would that make you more amenable to it?
No, I think that would be quite a dangerous move because of the question of the UK's international competitiveness. Many investors in the UK are not UK based, UK residents, and I think imposing national insurance on rents, for example, or dividends would be an extremely difficult move, extremely negative for the economy.
Finally, let me just put this to you. You've had a recent controversy with ACOBA, the government lobbying watchdog. They've told you off for talking to some high-ranking Treasury sort of servants. Now, I'm sure you'll say you didn't break any legal rules, but David Cameron has had similar problems of late with Greensill Capital. We know about those. What are your feelings on the rules as they stand on former government ministers lobbying? Should they be tightened?
Well, I'm not sure. Obviously, I don't think that my contact was inappropriate. I thought very carefully before I sent a single email to the Treasury, and because I was corresponding with the Treasury about a free offer that a bank had made to provide software to the Treasury, I didn't believe that that was within the rules, and I still don't believe that it is breaking any rules. But leave that aside. The rules are very complicated. The definitions are quite technical, and I do think it might be better if the rules were made clearer, even if that meant they were a bit more restrictive. I do think the rules are quite restrictive now, but they are very complicated.